All right, good morning, everyone. We'll get the webinar kicked off now. My name is Derek Lafitte, the Chief Revenue Officer here at Biarri Networks. Really excited to be the moderator for this webinar today. We've got a great group of industry thought leaders here to kind of share some thoughts, experiences, best practices, hopefully a little bit of worst practices as well. Quick rules, so all attendees will be muted, but the Q&A is open, so please feel free as we're going through the conversation. We're hearing from all these great guests and panelists that we have today. Feel free to send in some Q&A. We'll be kind of taking a look at those throughout the session. Anything that can kind of get some quick answers, we'll try to make sure we get that addressed through the Q&A, but otherwise we'll have a Q&A session at the end so that we will get to all those questions then. With that, I will turn it over to Paul Sulisz, who's the Chief Executive Officer here at Biarri Networks, to get us kicked off.
Thanks, Derek. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I know that we've got a interesting group of people that have joined, so thank you from all over the place, many continents. So we appreciate your time. I'd also like to extend a thank you to the panelists. We've got a really amazing group here, and I'll run through them, do brief intros, but by all means, if you're anything like me, you can stalk them. I mean, look them up on LinkedIn as much as you like and see their bios. Otherwise, we'll be talking bios for the next hour. So first, we're going to be kicking off with Scott Woods, who's from NTIA, he's the Director of Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives. Scott and I have known each other for a while now, and I know that, like the other panelists, he's really passionate about what he does there at NTIA. So we're going to get great insights. Monica Webb will talk next from Ting. Welcome, Monica. You know, and Monica is actually in a community in a city at the moment, no doubt having discussions about how they can help them. So that's exciting to hear it straight from the front. So welcome, Monica, to the panel. Next will be Patrick Thibault, who's the CTO at the Broadband Group. Pat and I have known each other for many, many years. We've got many war stories, some of which are G-rated enough to share on this panel. Duke Horan, welcome, Duke. Duke's from Mears Group. He'll be talking about construction and construction broadband networks on this panel. Welcome, Duke. And rounding out the panel will be Patrick Reams, who's the Director of Technology Services at Irby. And again, we've worked with Patrick Reams and his team for quite some time. Welcome, Patrick. Looking forward to your insights as well. All right, so that's the really fast version of the panel. And again, feel free to look them up on LinkedIn and other socials that we all use these days. So we'll get straight into it. I know we're crunched for time, and I know Scott's got a hard stop. He's on almost like a professional speaking tour at the moment. So thank you for making time this morning before you go live as well. So we'll kick things off. You know, at Biarri, we've really been on this tear of trying to get people to understand that we think that the only way we're going to get this done, get this digital divide actually bridged, is through collaborating with others. We think it's a team sport. It's a massive challenge, not only here in North America, but it is in other parts of the globe as well. And we see that there's a lot of commonality between those challenges across the world. And because of that, we thought it was a good idea to come up with a few fundamental steps on how we may help to bridge this divide. Predominantly, firstly, helping out and building out these teams here in the US and North America. And that's where we want to, for the most part, we'll focus our attention in this panel today. But it is a global problem, and it's something that we see as we travel around the place. And I'm sure that the panelists also have interesting insights from what they're seeing out there as things are moving. So in terms of the first few steps of that 9-step process, you know, we really have articulated that as one, the need, and then rallying the fans. So to kick things off, we're going to talk about that need. And Scott, you know, one of the things you mentioned this morning actually in a post was it's not really a divide anymore. You see it more as a chasm. And I think maybe we can start there, because what's your sense of how big is this problem, and is it getting smaller anytime soon? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Echo Paul's comments. It's great to be here with you all talking about this with this distinguished group of panelists. It is a chasm, right? I mean, it's oftentimes referred to as a divide, but as we saw with the pandemic, it is significant, particularly in communities that do not have access, don't adopt technology, don't have utilization of all of the various technology platforms available. And it's a lot bigger than what we even imagine, having been on the ground now for a number of years since the administration of the BTOP program, it seems like for have-not communities, for quote unquote vulnerable communities and unserved and underserved, that gap is indeed growing. And it's not just growing in the communities, but now into the institutions and the business that undergird and serve as the fabric of these communities. So again, to your point, it is a global issue, but here in the US, we've seen that it continues to grow. And hopefully with the programs, the grant programs that we launched last year, the historic amount of money that's in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as the money in private equity and private market right now, that collectively, as you talked about this team approach, collectively, there is enough collective goodwill and money and actions to address this issue.
Scott, so much of your work at the NTIA has really been about outreach. When we've talked on occasions over the last many months, we talk about that and how much time you spend out there with these communities in need. What are you seeing like at the front there? Like what are some interesting insights maybe that the audience can take away from this in terms of what's really going on out at the coalface in these communities in need?
So, I mean, that's a great question, Paul. And the first thing I tell people is, and this is somewhat controversial, you've got to humanize this, right? Oftentimes in DC, we speak in terms of billions of dollars and widgets and statistics, but we're talking about actual people in these communities that are the lifeblood of their communities. They love where they live. They've been there for generations. They want to improve, economic and social conditions, for their children, for their business, and to continue to grow. And so, the first thing that I often counsel is be intentional, right? And that means you have to be purposeful. You have to be on the ground and really understand, what drives these communities, our communities. And oftentimes you'll see that broadband is one of a number of issues that are in lack or in need of. And so, when we're in there working in those communities, we have to understand that there is a total backdrop of other infrastructure needs or historical issues that have taken place that we have to acknowledge. We're not there to fix those, but just focusing in on the broadband issue, the digital equity issue, adoption and inclusion issues, we can focus in on that, but you can't ignore the other issues that plague many of our communities. And I'm intentionally saying our, because I think we need to change the lexicon somewhat, because we always say them, those, we, them over there, those. It's actually we or our, because we're talking about the future of collectively our communities, of our American competitiveness, right? And so this inequity that exists ultimately hurts us competitively on a global basis. So it will behoove us, as if we are helping all of our communities grow. Ultimately, it puts us collectively in a better position globally to compete for what I call the next generation digital economy and those jobs that come along with it.
Scott, you mentioned humanizing this and talking about our communities. From that perspective, how do we help each other know what questions to ask? How do we help educate our communities to better, to ask the better questions, right? Because none of us can be experts, right? That's why we believe so strongly in this team approach. We will never know all the questions to ask and never know all the answers. What are some of the key questions that we should be going out there to our communities and helping them understand what will help them get along the path?
Yeah, that's another great question. I often go and say, you need to listen first. And then if you listen and the feedback that you receive or what you hear will then dictate the questions that you need to ask, right? So oftentimes we'll go into the community and then you immediately begin to, from our perspective, right, what we need, what you need to show, but we have yet to listen. We have yet to listen. And so, we've got to listen to the feedback, and that will drive ultimately the imposition and determination of the follow-up questions that we'll need to ask and get answered. And then from a practical standpoint, it's about collaboration and partnership. I'll use the Black community, African-American community as an example. I just spent a significant amount of time in rural Alabama in the Black Belt region, named the Black Belt because of the soil, not because of the people. But to think that you can go into that community and not partner with faith-based organizations and Black churches specifically, if that's not a part of your communications model, you're set up to fail, right? And so we need to understand that and have the right partnerships, right? Not the ones that just make sense from, where we may sit up here in DC or somewhere else, or even from a business standpoint, but really what works for the community. And that's engaging, state and local governments, that's engaging the faith community, engaging all of those community support organizations that, particularly through the pandemic, have upheld and kept these communities afloat. And so now to have that credibility to work in these communities, you've got to engage with those local leaders and those community leaders that have served as a lifeblood and continue to serve as a lifeblood in many of those communities.
Scott, it sounds like there's maybe some misconceptions around potentially the capabilities of certain areas of, let's say, state level governments and the influence they have versus the groundswell that's happening in these communities that you're mentioning, right? That you're speaking about, where the groundswell is coming from them, and these multi-denominational church groups, faith groups. It sounds like there's some sort of there's this visceral need that they're starting to understand and bring to bear. Do you have any other examples of how, what you've seen from that, similar to the Alabama example, and how do we better engage with those communities, that are, as you said before, right? And this is something that's going to stick with me. They're our communities. How do we help them? How do we serve them better?
I can give you an example of sort of the breadth of the issue. I recently did a speaking engagement in New York City, right? In Brooklyn, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which, 2 miles from the Barclays Center. It's your typical, urban area, right? Population density, everything, you name it. The issues that we heard from residents in Crown Heights were literally the exact same issues we heard from people in rural Alabama. They don't have connectivity in certain parts. So we know they're broadband deserts in urban areas. And the people that we spoke to that approached us in Brooklyn did not even know that New York State had a broadband office and had been operating a state level broadband grant program for several years, right? So that's an issue, right? So if we don't know that in a quote unquote, a big state, populous state, a populous area like, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York City, that's what we're faced against as we go through this uphill battle. And so I think we have to, I love your team approach, right? I'm a big sports fan, a big sports guy. Everyone has a role to play. Now, you look at the most successful teams, no one tries to do it all, right? Everyone has a role to play, but everyone accepts that role and they come to the game, the proverbial game, with a game plan. And that's what we need to do in this particular approach. We need to have an all hands on deck approach. Everyone has a role to play, from the local community organization all the way up to the service provider, state and local and federal government, private money, private philanthropy organizations. If we all work together and craft a plan, we can address and we can solve this issue. And I really believe that. But looking at the difference between a populous urban area in Brooklyn, versus a 17 county sparsely populated area in rural Alabama, and we're hearing the exact same themes: mistrust of both the state and federal government, historical resources not traditionally making it into quote unquote underserved or vulnerable areas and communities. There's a lot of work that we have to do to build up A, trust, and then B, that level of support that we'll need to ensure that these programs will be successful.
Thanks, Scott. That's quite startling, really, to think about somewhere as dense as in New York. I mean, that blows my mind a bit. But yeah, it's quite fascinating. I'm glad you're describing those commonalities, because I think that's another piece of misconception. People think that those that are living in big cities, they're all good, right? They're sorted, but that's clearly not the case. So yeah, I think we got to get better understanding what our roles are in that team that we're trying to put together. Monica, I'm going to jump to you now, if I may. And as we kicked off, you're in a community, you're in a city. a lot of your work is engaging with communities and with cities. What are the key signs you look for that sort of tell you that they're ready, and that there's a chance of success? Because we all know there's a lot of these projects that don't work for a whole bunch of reasons. What are some of those key things that you see or you look for that help you understand that, yes, this community, this city is ready to try to undertake this tough work of bridging this divide?
Sure. And, from Ting's perspective, it partly depends on how we've come to meet and engage with these communities. In the case where a community has issued an RFP for, an internet service provider to build or to partner on a network, that really signifies that they've thought carefully about their desired outcomes. They've created a framework for partnership and engagement, and they're ready to choose a partner according to the criteria that they've identified to make it happen. So when we see that, we know a community is ready to move. The next step up would be if they've issued an RFI, which indicates they know they want fiber to the premise in their community. They definitely understand the benefits, but they're exploring who those potential partners might be, what kind of partnership options and models would be available to them, and generally getting a feel for the options that are out there. So an RFI gives them that information without requiring them, like an RFP would, to create a specific framework for engagement or choose a specific respondent. So it's kind of a jumping off point where they gather information. It generally leads to further discussions between potential internet service providers or infrastructure builders and the cities. And potentially the city can then decide, based on what they learn, to engage with a specific partner. But there's less of a formal framework than there would be with an RFP.
Gotcha.
And I would say that, I'd say the third way that we meet these cities is either a consultant, or there's been another introduction, or sometimes the city's reached out to us.
Mm-hmm.
And that signifies, again, that they're aware of the importance of universal fiber. They likely know the options. They've done their research, and they or the consultant specifically want us. So they're definitely ready to engage. And I would say lastly, and this is something that we've done a lot more recently, is we've reached out to a city. And this is a place where cities may or may not be ready. It really depends on their level of understanding and appreciation for fiber to the premise. So it requires a lot of relationship building, ensuring the right staff and electeds are brought to the table at the right times, and education to get to a point where the city is ready. And one of our specific challenges is we often microtrench when we deploy. And that is a hurdle that we need to get over with a lot of cities in understanding the significant benefits of using that, because it's to them, it's not a traditional deployment method. It's something that, although it's been used throughout the US the last 10, 20 years, it's just starting to populate in terms of how to accommodate it in the city landscape.
So in terms of these cities having RFPs, RFIs out there, that in itself is quite the undertaking, right? Because, that they would have had to commit to get someone to help them, because typically I would imagine they don't have the expertise to put together an RFI or run an RFI, RFP process. Are you seeing the right kinds of things in those, or is this an opportunity for Ting to engage with those to say, we got your RFI, but we have some other ideas? Can you give us some insights on that? Because we've read some, and I feel like I get what they're asking for, but that's not what they need, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say, honestly, we do find that the RFIs and RFPs are all over the map. And sometimes they're asking for, spreadsheets of financial models and things like that. And, that's a case where, if we're bringing our money to invest in a community, I think the community really needs to focus on what they need out of it, what their residents and businesses need out of it, and making sure that their potential partners meet that. Some of the earlier towns we engaged with, they did RFIs and they were very short and to the point. And so we were able to provide a great solution. When we have to spend, weeks gathering information to respond to an RFI or an RFP, I think the downside for the city is some potential respondents may not have the bandwidth to put together a response that may have been a credible partner. So if there's anything I can encourage to cities, I would say, focus on what you need in terms of speed, in terms of coverage, in terms of completion timeline, in terms of digital divide elements in your community, and what the customer experience is going to be with potential partners. Focus on that. And then, anything that seems, not critical to that mission, maybe consider leaving it out. I think in large part, most cities are, as you mentioned, do they put together these on their own? Mostly they're using consultants. And I think sometimes there's maybe a lot in there that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah. I think you raise a really interesting and critical point, Monica. That is that these communities, they need to focus on that community and what they need, what it needs in terms of bridging that digital divide. What would you say, is their level of understanding? How can we help, to what Scott said, our communities understand the importance of, anchor institutions and beyond just the resident, which is critical, having the understanding that maybe there are anchor institutions that can help bring internet, fiber broadband connectivity into that community?
Sure. I mean, I think with anchor institutions, many cities will already have their anchor institutions connected. They may already have some fiber that connects them. And certainly that can be leveraged by a private partner if they have excess fiber that can lease that, and it expedites the build. It also gives the city the benefit of some cost recovery funding on that investment, and then build out from there to residential customers. I do think we certainly saw in the pandemic, one of the things that Ting did immediately was stand up locations within each municipality that we're in, where it was a space where people could drive up, they could walk up, and everyone felt welcome. So it was very publicly welcoming and accessible, but it was also had fiber fed to it. And we put up outdoor next generation wireless access points. It was very easy for us to do. I mean, the hardest part was really finding the locations. We did that. And we thought, we're trying to do our part. And we were amazed by how significantly these were used by the communities. And, for us and that's somewhere where anchor institutions can be a great spot to help those that do not have broadband at home. Or in the case of, the pandemic, some people did have broadband at home, but all the networks ground to a halt. The traditional networks, non-fiber networks, ground to a halt because of all the traffic, residential traffic from home. So I see anchor institutions as playing definitely a role in making sure that is an option for people for digital divide. But beyond that, it's really important for everybody to have access to internet at home. And, there's the issue of there are communities that just don't have access. I lived in Western Massachusetts for 14 years, and my only option was, initially dial-up and then satellite. But they're more important. They're not more important, but equally important issues to access, that I think Scott got into, which is you do have an urban divide where you have a lot of people that they can't afford the cost for having access to a fiber network. And I'm really encouraged now that we have the ACP program, for example, at the federal level, because affordability is something we didn't necessarily contemplate. We really focused funding on access. And now we're realizing access and affordability are both equally important to bridging the digital divide. And I think communities in their planning efforts need to look at both of those things.
Yeah, thank you. That's so important. In terms of again, you engage with so many communities, so many cities. What are and again, you touched on the fact that anchor institutions, do have a role to play. What are some other misconceptions about what it costs to actually deploy fiber, to our communities, right? You're talking a lot about every home should have fiber and it should be affordable. What are some misconceptions around the cost to do that?
Sure. I mean, there are, I would say, misconceptions generally. Sometimes there's a misconception around the time frame to build an entire city with fiber as well. You're talking about building entire infrastructure. But in terms of the cost that the city will need to account for, and I'm going I'm going to describe a variety of models. It could be where, Ting is coming in and building the entire network. It could be where Ting is coming in and leveraging a city fiber ring and then building up from there. Or it could be a situation which, we've done in Westminster, Maryland, and now we're going to do in Colorado Springs, where either a city or utility builds a fiber to the premise network and we ride on top of it and provide service. So the funding, most of the funding for the network comes from the city or the utility in that standpoint. So we have different levels of investment on behalf of the city. I would say certainly for cities where we're coming in and building or we're leveraging their network, there's perhaps it's not fully thought out about we're talking about building new infrastructure across the entire city, and the level of throughput that will require in permitting and inspections. Many cities will need to actually bring on new staff to undertake that level of throughput. So that's something that needs to be undertaken at a budgeting level. Certainly, when we file permits, we pay for that, but it's understanding and planning for that and making sure that the level of throughput is there so that we can build these networks as quickly as possible. I would say when a city is building either a fiber ring or a city or utility or an entire network, and we don't see this across the board. Sometimes we do see where cities are advised that this will be a profit center for the city. Generally speaking, cities will probably spend more to build the network in the same footprint more than a private sector entity would spend. And sometimes you will not get, it may be a profit center in 20 years, but it's being really realistic about those financial models. You may just offset some cost recovery. So making sure the political support is there and being realistic about the cost recovery / profit timeline and model with respect to building, any city infrastructure from just a ring to an entire network.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Monica, because that's something that through conversations that we've had, even with whether it be VC, private equity, and others, there is this sense of we're in a gold rush from that infrastructure investment perspective. How do we build this thing as quick as we can, and then in some cases we're going to flip this thing, right? They see it as an investment that gets flipped. But what you're talking to is these are investments that need to be, a long 20, 30 year lifespan needs to be considered. This isn't a quick thing. And I would imagine that if we're doing it for the right reasons for our communities, then it shouldn't be seen as a thing that is flipped. We're thinking about the community, our community and our residents first and foremost.
Yeah. And one thing I would just add on to that is with cities that haven't necessarily been in the business of managing multiple utilities, it may be more of a challenge getting into this. We now have, we're the first anchor tenant on a network that's going to be built by Colorado Springs Utilities. With utilities, they have a lot more experience managing infrastructure and managing all of the elements of that. And they tend to have I would say a better grasp of everything that's going to be required in terms of the financing, the building, accounting for things. So, it might be helpful for a lot of cities to talk to publicly owned utilities, utility co-ops, to get more of a perspective on how to make sure you're adequately planning for that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Monica. I'm going to jump now to the more of the planning side of things with Patrick Thibault. Pat, let's talk about engineering and planning and maybe some of the approaches that have worked for the TPG. You've clearly been across a number of deployments in this life and a former life. What are some of the critical path items that these municipalities and communities should be thinking about when planning out? As Monica said, this is a long-term deployments. They need to be ready and these cities, communities need to be ready for the timeframes that to get this done. What are some of those key elements that you see time and time again that people should be considering?
Sure, thanks, Paul. For starters, communities need to understand the metrics of the industry, right? And then a lot of work goes into being successful at these projects. They need to think about what business model suits them, what type of partnership, as Monica talked about. and research and understand if that type of business model will be successful in their market, right? Not all business models fit all markets. Once you understand that, you need to start the planning, right? You need to understand the architectures that fit that business model. You need to understand what type of network you need, what type of excess capacity that you can monetize in other ways, what level of redundancy you need. Are you using network splitters? Are you not? What material choices? What are the lead times for materials, permitting, which we talked about. You also need to plan how you're going to connect every home, right? If that's the plan, how are you going to go between the curb and the house and private property issues. All of these things become the design rules for tools like Biarri, right, to incorporate in the design. Other hurdles to be considered are what can your community or your municipality use for infrastructure and paths, right? There's public rights of way, existing easements, as well as the ability to attach to poles. Attaching poles and overall pole conditions can lead to cost savings as well as unexpected costs. And staffing, right? Do you have the right skills to be successful getting your project done?
So Pat, you just mentioned that that using or attempting to reuse existing infrastructure. What have you seen across a bunch of deployments in terms of those unexpected? Maybe it's a windfall or maybe it's an additional cost. What are some of the things that you've seen in terms of how those utilities can best, prepare for that? And in terms of, and again, to your point, they may not be staffed up for a massive deployment, right? And what's required to be out there attaching and or the associated make-ready engineering and construction. What would be the advice you give to those that are looking at that as a, hey, maybe we could use our own staff, or hey, maybe we should do this with this team that we already have?
Yeah, I think part of our conversations with utilities have been, you have your project, but there will be additional investment by incumbents and others as well, and you need to plan that into your teams. You talked a bit about poles, and I find when we work with utilities, they have higher standards for who connects for themselves when they connect to their own poles. So make ready sometimes costs look a little different than if you were just the comms attacher in those communities.
Gotcha. What other real things should we be considering in terms of making sure that these projects are successful, right? I mean, these are long, multi-year projects. What else can be done from an engineering design perspective to help shore up success?
I think the simple answer there is planning. It's the hardest part. You need to spend a lot of time to do it properly. Months and sometimes years are needed to get a network construction project going if you're not already in the business, right? I think people forget that communities that we're talking about aren't already active out there. They know, what suppliers, what materials, what it looks like, right? So they have to start from scratch. Business models often dictate the network architectures you need to build. Just having fiber on Main Street is not enough. You have to have access to it so you can serve each and every building if that's what you need. Knowing what equipment manufacturers and their specifications you'll be using can change the way engineering and design is planned. Each of these decisions feed into the next. Every new decision may affect previous decisions. You often have to go back and make sure that the plans don't need to change because something downstream has changed, right? Like changing out fiber manufacturer, splitter manufacturer might change design limitations on distances. In short, Paul, planning's critical. Spend a lot of time on it.
Yeah, so that's something that, Pat, it occurs to me that some people just want to get moving, right? They want to just hurry up and get this done. So to get them to pause and plan and think critically about this, and also further to what you mentioned around equipment, there's such a tight constraint on resources, construction labor, and material. Mainly due part to the pandemic and what that's done to global supply chain. How do you get a community that wants to run out of the gate to pause and slow down and plan properly?
I think we spent a lot of time talking about dependencies, right? I think when we are running projects, we set a lot of ambitious goals, but in the back of our mind, we have some more realistic ones, and eventually, things erode, schedules slip, but understanding what those dependencies are, what's key and critical, right? When do you need conduit versus fiber versus, splicing labor? If you can line all that up, you'll still be successful.
And finally, Pat, for you, for many years now, you've been looking at auto approaches to design engineering, algorithmic approaches. And this isn't, because we work together, but just generally speaking, what are the key benefits of that that you would like to impart on the audience? And just to be clear, we oftentimes say if people want a certain approach that particularly we don't do, but it is more in auto design in nature, then we point them elsewhere. But out of curiosity, and you've been through this many times. I don't think it's considered voodoo anymore. It's what it used to be called about 7 years ago. What do you see the benefits of taking that style of approach to engineering and design?
I think the biggest benefit is the ability to make consistent decisions over and over again across your whole project. You can pick a design section, understand the rules and guidelines that went into that design, and know that those decisions will be consistent. You have to have good rules to get a good design, but you need to spend time on those reviews to get these smart reviews, smart rules, right? So you come up with the plan, you say what you want, you look at what that looks like on paper, and then you revisit those rules and improve. Yeah,
gotcha. Thank you. Actually, I've got one more question for you. I think, the broadband group and yourself have worked with many partners throughout the years. What are the key things you guys look for in terms of good partners in what you're trying to do out there in the marketplace and for our communities?
I think for us, it comes down to the team and the team's experience. Right, software itself doesn't solve all problems. It's helpful, but it's the discussions and the planning that goes into how that software is used that's really going to have your desired outcomes.
Great, thanks, Pat. Now, before I move to Duke as well, from a construction perspective, I just wanted to remind everyone that please feel free to use the Q&A. We'll get to those at the end. Yeah, we'll try to get through all of them if we have time. I know Scott's got a hard stop before he goes on stage. We'll try to get through all questions as best we can. All right,
hey,
Duke.
Paul, I'm sorry, before we move on, can I add just to that?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Patrick was talking about, if you don't mind, just briefly.
Go for it.
I think this is also important that local communities also understand their own area, their own data, right? I think that's going to be key, and they can do that, understanding the demographics and income. Both high end and limitations, right? Understanding what their communities can pay for, broadband services, to take advantage of the ACP and to work with local service providers. So I think there's a lot of data that's available that local communities can begin to better understand, and that will enable them to have, I think, more fuller conversations, not just with the state broadband office, but also with local service providers and other stakeholders in their community. So, whether they're doing crowdsourcing or demand aggregation exercises, there are things that communities can do, to ensure that when they sit down at the table, and being at the table is very important, but when they're sitting down at the table, they have their data, actionable data that they can support, that goes to Monica's point, how their business community, what their business community needs, what the education community needs, not just the residents and end users, but all of the segments of their community, what they actually need, so that when these projects are delivered, right, they actually are targeted to meet the benefits, to meet the demand needs of the community. And I will also say this: it's not just infrastructure, right? There's equity arguments. There are equity concerns, there's training and workforce development. These things go hand in hand. And so again, a comprehensive, going to Patrick's point about comprehensive planning encompasses both the infrastructure, expansion or build, as well as the digital equity access and inclusion component as well, because they can't be separate, right? They should be going on. Those type of activities, discussions, and plans, must take place at the same time.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Scott. And perhaps that's something we dive into at a later date as well, because I think that's sometimes forgotten, is that, okay, great, now everyone should have access and it's great, it's affordable, we're almost there. But then it's like, so I'm assuming that a lot of our community have no idea what next in terms of how they actually make use of that, whether it be for education, telehealth, telemedicine, and other critical factors that obviously got exposed during the pandemic as well. So look, thank you for adding that, Scott. Duke, coming to you from a construction perspective, what are some of the typical questions that you should be asking at the beginning of a construction project, to decide on what's the best approach there, and what are the things that you see come in time and time again?
Well, so we'll start off. There's different places that you need to ask questions, and it's not just to your contractors. It's also to yourself. It's also to the other stakeholders. One thing that tends to happen quite a bit in these projects, because they're long, and I say long because when you start all the way at the front end from a funding and research perspective, all the way through to, hey, we finally built it. That front end, to get it funded, to get it planned, takes a significant amount of time. And a lot of people lose a lot of patience through it because it does tend to drag on because of what's happening. By the time it gets to construction, everybody's made the decision that, hey, we're ready to go, we're ready to build, let's build. Why isn't it built yet? And so we tend to get shortchanged at the very end of a project, because in a lot of ways, we are the back end of it. We're the ones that in a lot of ways should take the most amount of time, because it's actually building the infrastructure. But like I said, at that point in time, everybody's already made the decision that, hey, we're going forward. So how do we move this forward as fast as we can? So you've got to, especially when you're building community networks, you get a lot of excitement at that point in time. Once you've made that decision of, hey, we're going to get gigabit internet to our house. Well, then it's, when's it going to be here? We may be starting 2 neighborhoods away. So there's a lot of communication that needs to get asked as well. So I think I would start firstly with the questions that you need to ask the community. You need to ask the cities, you need to ask the utilities that are there, is, are they really ready, and are they really ready to support it? And I think Patrick might have brought this up earlier. Are they ready to permit it? The permitting agencies may not even be ready for a project that's this large. They're not used to, building up and down every single street in their community. They're used to a project that might be 2 or 3 blocks long, not up and down every single street in the community. So are they ready? Are all the city-owned utilities ready to actually locate the stuff that they've got in the ground? So right now, the city may own water and sewer. We find this almost everywhere right now, that the cities cannot keep up with the construction crews. I could actually throw more crews in a lot of communities. I can't go to work because I don't know where anything is. So there's a lot of nuts and bolts that really needs to be asked on the front end. And it needs to be asked in the planning phase, because if we wait until, hey, we're ready to submit for a permit and we're ready to go to work, well, then we go to the water department and say, well, we've got one guy, and he's been here for 40 years and he knows where everything is and he will locate it. Well, if I'm doing 1 mile to 2 to 3 miles a day of construction, he can't paint that much out. He doesn't have the capacity to do it himself. So you have to go through and ask those questions up front so the city can be prepared for a construction project like that. Once you've kind of got past those questions to be asked, then you go towards okay, I'm looking for partners, vendors, engineering partners, construction vendors. And with the market the way it is right now, there's a lot of new people that are coming into the industry. And there's a lot of folks that have been small contractors. And I'll tell you that, the telecom industry has been built out by small contractors across America for 40 years. It's the lifeblood of the construction industry. However, with the sheer volume of work that has to be done between now and I'll say the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, the capacity within the industry isn't quite there. And so what you've got to do is figure out the folks that have the experience, that have built some of these larger projects, that have the project management, the safety, the quality type of infrastructure, process and procedure in place, because otherwise you're just throwing a bunch of people out there to get some work done. Not to say the project won't get done, but there's no continuity to it. So you really have to be able to ask your contractors, explain to me what your project plan is. How would you go about building our community network? How would you go about working in different parts of town at the same time? How would you go about working in communities? How would you go about your communication once you start construction? We've talked a lot about communicating with the communities up front, and and talking to the residents. But when we get to construction, that's when people start to get mad. First of all, they were excited, and now there's a crew with a shovel in their front yard digging a hole. So if you're not prepared as a construction contractor and as a community to address that, to say, yes, there is going to be construction in front of your house, and we will try to make it as low impact as possible. But the bottom line is construction projects are not pretty. People don't like to see somebody dig up their flower garden, and it's going to happen. So, but you have to be prepared for that. Because the bottom line, if I go past somebody's house, and as a construction contractor, I make them mad during construction, they're always going to hold a grudge towards that network, even though it was me. And the bottom line is they don't want to order service from whoever it was that was building that network. So you've lost customers because of that. So it makes it very difficult from a contractor standpoint, because we have to be ready for that. So you got to ask those questions. How are you going to communicate? How are you going to put door hangers on the door so people know that you're going to be there? Talk through those things. And then I think Patrick brought it up, just the experience that your contractors and your vendors and your partners have. So you can talk through. You're not going to be able to get the experience of everybody all the way down to the bottom, because the market doesn't have that many people out there that have done it that many times. So figure out the principles. Who are the principles that are going to be there, that are going to be able to bring that experience into your project, so that you can make it a smooth project, as smooth as possible. Because it's kind of like making sausage. Nobody wants to see it, but we all love it in the end. Same thing. Construction is the same way.
Thanks, Duke. I think you touched on and answered my next question around a number of the factors that help a project be successful. One of the things that we see, it's very tough to have the construction vendor engage right at the beginning, right? It's very rare that we are in the same room from a planning perspective with a constructor, and it's something that I'm not sure what the answer is, but I know that in past, when we've started with the end in mind and had construction in the room to help better understand how we can make them more efficient and what else we need to be considering to make their lives easier, it usually goes a lot smoother, but it is tough to line that up for a number of reasons. But for those that want to contemplate that, and what are some of the things that those communities should be doing beyond what you said, like understand that this isn't pretty, this is going to take time. What other advice could you give people to make sure they are ready to make these projects successful, and by that I mean you also as a construction vendor come out of it feeling really good about the outcome?
Well, no, that's a great question, and you actually kind of addressed the first point that I would make, which is involve the partners as early as possible, especially your construction partners, because in the end, your construction partners end up being critical to your communication plan. And it's easy to sit in an office somewhere and come up with a communication plan, but then when you actually have to implement it, and something as simple as, hey, we've got a door hanger and there's a tag we want to place on every single door. What information goes on that door hanger? Is it a marketing tool? Because it is in some ways, but it's also a tool to be sure that, hey, if we've got an issue somewhere, somebody can address it. Who should be answering that phone? Does that phone go to your construction vendor, or does it actually go to your marketing department? And we've actually found that marketing departments are probably the right spot for it, because in the end, you want to turn that person into a customer, even though they may not be. They're probably calling because they're not happy. You'll get quite a few calls of, when are you going to be here? But most of the calls are, hey, somebody stepped on one of my tulips, and you can address that up front and keep them as a customer. So that's an important part. And I've said this a few times, but you need a dedicated communication strategy. How are you going to market, and how are you going to communicate neighborhood by neighborhood? And for the folks that aren't getting service first, how do you communicate to them and not get them discouraged and say, oh, you're forgetting about us? Everybody wants to be first, but not everybody can be first. So that has to be part of your communication and marketing plan as well. The other thing that I've seen quite a bit, and I kind of talked about this a few minutes ago, but don't shortchange the schedule or the budget. And the schedule is the first one to get shortchanged, because it's, hey, we've worked for 3 years to get this going. How much can we get built in the next 6 months? And the other thing that'll happen is, well, let's look at the budget. And this happens probably more in the private sector than it does in the public sector, but in the private sector, it's, hey, we've got this amount of budget per home passed. This is how much we can spend. And prior to actually analyzing the data of what it's really going to take to build there, it's turned into, this is what we can spend. So you set a budget based on that. And what we're finding, and I could say over the last 15 to 20 years, places where you can build and there's significant amount of aerial infrastructure and poles that are accessible, historically have always been the places that people look at and say, we need to build there because we can get there and it's cheaper. What we find is it isn't always cheaper because of all the additional work that has to happen on those poles. And some of them aren't accessible. And there's times when it just takes a significantly longer amount of time to get the access to those poles. So it's not a great story, but it's something that has to be discussed up front, because if you don't, you're going to get halfway down the road and realize, well, this isn't working the way we expected it to. Where if you had the right partners on the front end telling you those things, you probably can get that information. The other thing that I think is important is public works within every city needs to be involved early. You can meet with the mayor's office all day, and the mayor's office is great, and the mayor's office loves to tell you the things you want to hear and loves to tell the residents the things that they want to hear. But in the end, there's a group that manages the roadways for that city, and it is their job to manage the infrastructure within that city. And if a construction project is going to come in and impact those roadways, if they're not involved up front, you're going to get some resistance when you bring them in later and say, hey, we just told this contractor that he can build up and down every single street in the city. And all of a sudden, Public Works says, well, if it's going to be that, then here's the process we've got to go through. Here's what I want to see. And then as a contractor, we're sitting here saying, hold on, nobody told us that we were going to have to go through that process, that we can't work through this schedule because the limitations that the city's putting on. And it's really just something where those folks weren't involved early enough. So it's all about getting those folks on early so that they can be there and give their input. You talked a few minutes ago about things that make projects successful, and that's a big list of it. And what I talked about up front was a big part of that too. But academically, it's very simple. Construction projects for the last 100 years have been measured by two things. Was it probably three? Was it on time? Was it under budget? And probably over the last 30 years, was it a safe job site? But prior to that, it was on time and on budget. I would challenge everyone to expand your definition of what it takes to be successful, because just being on time and on budget when you're building infrastructure doesn't necessarily get it done. Because if you've gone through and blown through the city and made 2/3 of the residents mad when you've gone through, you're not going to be able to get the customers you needed in the first place, because they're always going to think, I don't want that. Those are the guys that tore up my yard. Those are the guys that caused this problem at the end of the street where I had to detour for 6 weeks. So you actually have to redefine what's a successful project a little bit, to not just be what is academically known as, a successful construction project, on time and on budget. So you gotta expand that a little bit more. And part of that is just like we were talking about, getting everybody involved on the front end. And the last thing I'll add on to here, and I talked about it with regards to the city-owned utilities, the other utilities that are out there, whether it be a cable company, a phone company, gas, quite often, to let them know that you're looking at a project and figure out prior to construction starting what it's going to take for them to be able to support the project. Because if you don't know where your gas lines are up front, it's too dangerous to actually do the work. So you got to be sure you bring those folks in up front as well. So
thanks, Duke. That's fantastic. I think, just to to sort of circle back on some things that Scott started with as well. You know, if this is a true, well-running team, there's a lot of communication, right? The best teams out there communicate. They communicate fearlessly, and that's what makes them so great. And from what you're saying is that a lot of this success is underpinned by a very, solid communication strategies, and then executing on that with all the stakeholders. So beyond just those directly engaged, involved with the project, thinking more broadly about your other stakeholders in the community, across the other utilities, and those that somehow, the project touches. So I think that's an important message. So thank you for sharing that. I think it's it's one of those things we joke about, and I'm sure everyone else on this call has over the years as well. For a communications industry, we suck at communicating sometimes. Like it's sometimes humorous and sometimes quite disappointing. Thanks, Duke. I'm going to jump now to Patrick Reams. Pat, I want to get your insights into more of the critical operation side of things and expansion, right? So, you've obviously got experience in rolling out, building, and operating. And one of the things that one of the questions we get asked or we're engaged with conversation on is, and I think Patrick touched on this as well, is the concept of future proofing. And sometimes some people think that's you're sparing the network, you're putting spares in, you're putting future capacity. And there is this emphasis on future proofing these networks for our communities. What do you think we should be thinking about, and what does future proofing mean to you as someone involved in deploying and then operating networks?
Thanks, Paul. Future proofing really is infrastructure that can scale with technology. And I think we've all danced around the elephant in the room, and that really is that it's fiber, that hybrid coaxial networks, DSL networks, and wireless networks that require spectrum aren't future proof. They're always a moment in time. They may be a moment in time that solves a tactical need, and they're not necessarily a bad thing. I've deployed fixed wireless networks for decades, but a future-proof network is something that easily scales without regulatory adjustment, or tremendous reinvestment in the material. And we're still operating fiber networks that were installed in the 70s with new equipment today. So networks that delivered kilobits of service in the late 70s are now delivering hundreds of gigabits of service today with upgrades to the electronics. So that's, I think, the first key. And once I think as a community understand that in the end, a fiber connected home, like Monica said, is the goal. It may not be the immediately achievable goal, but it's the long-term goal. Then how do we build those so we can build networks that scale to that? And that's really where I think Biarri has helped us, is that we've been able to model the network investment for our customers, who are have to this point primarily been rural electric providers, who are now actually being asked to come into their county seats, into the small cities that they surrounded, as a community institution that can then provide broadband. Because we're able to effectively model the cost of that. Like, as we work with the teams at Biarri to look at how much sparing and where do we build now versus what would we overbuild later, and put that information out there. Because when we're spending these large capital expenditures, this may be the only time in a generation that these entities have the capital to build the infrastructure. So how much could they build, should they build, will they build, can be determined through good data. And what Patrick said earlier about planning, I think that really is the focus that we've been able to bring to bear, is look at architectural choices, look at design rules, look at what can happen, and then determine if we've got the budget to pay for it, or how we get the budget to pay for it. And I think that's particularly poignant with the BEAD grants that are coming down now, whether we're talking about, I think the digital divide is wide in rural areas and very deep in urban areas. I think we've got to look at it. They're two different problems that really have the same need, which is planning and information to apply this limited and kind of moment in time funding in the best way forward.
Patrick, it's interesting. you know, your opening statement to define future proofing, I find interesting, because when I speak to a lot of technologists, typically most will jump to an architecture that they favor, right? So people immediately jump to, well, it has to be this architecture, right? And they're typically engineers, you know, bless their cotton socks. I can say that because I'm an engineer by trade. But it's interesting, you know, you were saying that it's not necessarily purely just that, right? It's more than just that. And it sounds like the need, you got to think about things more holistically, is what I got out of your response there. Is that something that you see common when you're talking with other technologists and engineers out there, or maybe even suppliers of equipment that want to sell you their latest kit, right?
No, I think that's really probably one of the challenges is that either you have, you know, a thing and you want this thing to be what's successful, or you have a short-term goal where you look at, I need to get connectivity to these locations, and like Duke was saying, with this budget, and I'll take whatever shortcuts I need to get those two goals accomplished without looking at what I'm going to do 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, particularly for municipalities and really utilities. So, you know, we talked about how a municipal utility already has business services, but there's a big difference from being the incumbent monopoly utility to becoming a business who's competing for coverage in some areas. And that's particularly in covering the suburban and urban digital divide. That's the biggest thing, is that you may be a citywide utility that has ubiquitous service, and in the areas of most need, you may be the only viable provider, but in the areas where there is perhaps the most spend, you know, the most available income, you may be a second or third provider. So it's modeling that and having the data to model that effectively up front, I think is key to making that investment future proof.
So Patrick, you're talking, you know, around the importance of planning, you know, coming back to some of the things that Pat Tebow was saying, you know, in terms of the conversations you have, you know, with communities and, you know, your stakeholders, what other considerations come into play, you know, and particularly when it comes to this future expansion? Like, I know of at least one project whereby initially it was, hey, we're going to have to go fixed wireless, and it quickly turned to, you know what, forget that, we're going to have to we have to get out of the gate and just go full fiber. So when you're thinking about expansions and future proofing from you know that there's a developing cities, right? This is a developing footprint. What other considerations should people be thinking about?
Well, I think the thing really is looking at where growth patterns are, where development patterns are, and making sure that the infrastructure you put in place is able to be economically scaled, so that when this development comes in, we're redoing everything. An example, we're working at an area. A lot of our work is in the Mid-South of America, so we're working in one project in Arkansas where it's rock, about 50 to 60% rock. And Duke will get this. The guys are slamming along at like 80 feet a day. This is going to be the most expensive fiber we put in the ground. It'll be really protected because you can't get to it with a backhoe. But as we built through there, this particular area has about 4,000 homes, but there are 16,000 or so plotted. It's a subdivision. There are 16,000 or so plotted areas. And since the pandemic, people are now moving there all of a sudden. They've heard that there's going to be fiber, and they've got this idyllic land that they've had, and now they want to build on it. Well, how do you build a network that's underground and horrendously expensive, that then supports people who are going to build in maybe 10 years? So being able to model that and make decisions about where you cut the lines, where you draw, how you segment something for something we might build a decade from now is, I think, really powerful. And that's not something you can do in a traditional linear pen and paper design.
Do you have any, and look, just maybe an extension of that one, Pat, or maybe another project, have you got any success stories, recent success stories whereby you started off with a footprint, and then with that sort of philosophy of thinking, very longer term, and, you know, fiber first where possible, of where you managed to expand a footprint, and, you know, what are some of the things that you heard from your community in those areas?
Well, absolutely. So, you know, our key point project with Biarri at Empower by Craighead Electric, we built that project ahead of schedule and under budget, and meeting the community needs during the pandemic, passing 28,000 unserved locations. That entity is now able to go to communities that they don't serve electrically and start offering broadband options that weren't on the table before. We're talking about, you know, municipal areas maybe of 5 to 10,000 homes that really weren't getting the attention of the national providers, but now they've got a community institution that's able to go serve them. And so that's that design and expansion and the ability to take those consistent rules. So we have the rules from the Biarri design, we simply feed the additional data to it and can easily cost model what it is to work with the local institutions and go, here's what we need from you to make this happen. And that's getting things done. That's building, expanding on the original footprint, on the original mission that Empower had as a member-owned cooperative, to now serving non-members but neighbors. And that's building that kind of community that we didn't have in 2018 when we started that project.
Right. Thank you, Patrick. You know, if there's any words of caution to others, you know, that are in your seat, you know, with the battle scars you've got, what would that be?
Standardize as much as possible. The issues with supply chain are not going to get any better anytime soon. Get rid of snowflakes. Try to pick some cable sizes you can live with and use those. That's what we've done for our customers, and that's been able to enable a great success. And that we have, you know, the Henry Ford model of you can have any cable you want as long as it's black. You know, if everything is an individual for this 1 mile section, and you're always going to be waiting for that, everything that you need to build that section. Build your networks consistently and with a reduced set of inputs, and then you'll be able to build them successfully.
Fantastic. Thanks, Patrick. All right, we're going to jump into Q&A while we still have Scott around for a little while too. So the first question I think is for, maybe I can throw to all panelists one after the other, but if we can just keep our answers somewhat concise, that'd be great. So the first one is, have any of the panelists encountered any red tape and or politics when accessing city-owned infrastructure? If so, how did you handle it? Who wants to jump at that one first? Looks like everyone's chipping to dive in on that one.
I can start quickly. So absolutely politics plays a big part of it. Some of it can be alleviated by getting the public works departments involved. So a lot of the politics actually involved the public works department not being involved and not being on the same page with the mayor's office. So you got to be sure that those departments are all aligned. And I can tell you that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because once you get to that point of being on the wrong side of politics, it's a challenge. But I think the areas that we've been able to see that coming and address it up front was really the way to beat that.
Got it. Thanks, Duke.
And I would say, you know, for us, talking through any issues, any red tape issues, being reasonable is always the first option that we go to. And, you know, it has a lot to do with what type of relationship you've established from the outset with the potential municipality. So that's something that has certainly helped us, is having an open, honest, and reasonable relationship to start. You know, that being said, sometimes in terms of elected officials, sometimes there are political dynamics between electeds where, you know, this politician supports it, and because this other politician is in opposition, different parties or different agendas, you know, they may not. And so you really need to do a lot of groundwork to make sure that everybody sees the benefits of supporting this kind of infrastructure, And lastly, and this speaks a little to the last answer, I think balancing the engagement with staff and electeds, certainly having, you really need, the deployment is going to be very much contingent on staff cooperation. And so it really is important to make sure that they feel engaged and empowered in the decision to go forward and how to streamline that process.
Thank you, Monica.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Yes, of course, political red tape is often encountered. Paul said it earlier, we need to communicate well, communicate clearly so there's no open-ended interpretation. And I think you got to remind everybody mutual purpose here, right? Your project has a reason, has some goals, and likely any political pushback just needs to realize they're trying to arrive at the same goals.
Thanks, Pat.
I chime in, just think from my perspective, I think we're fortunate that due to the pandemic, in part, broadband is one of those bipartisan issues, right? And so when you're looking to do something that is for the community's good, right, both businesses and anchor institutions and the like, right, it typically should not get caught up in the political process, right? We understand that there are facets, right? But what I've seen is a real reluctance to address bureaucratic issues, political issues, resolve those to move forward in this particular issue. So hopefully we can get those to expand into other issues, but I'm not here for that. But for this particular issue, that we found that our local and state and federal, honestly, elected leaders have made it significantly easier to hopefully build out not just the network infrastructures, but also the adoption, the equity, the training, the workforce development, the economic development components that go along with it.
Thanks, Scott. The next question I've got is, how have you all obtained data needed to identify connectivity needs in communities?
I'll take that one to start with, and the answer is everywhere. There's publicly available data. There's survey work. There's if there is a utility, they typically may have a relationship with the people they're providing service to. There's currently in the United States, there's no central repository for good data on service levels. I think we could have an entirely different webinar on whether the new mapping efforts will develop that, but right now it's very much a local feedback loop that needs to be established and helps drive that conversation.
Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, and I would agree with Patrick. I mean, I remember when we were in Western Mass, we had at that time we were dealing with pockets of DSL and we were trying to identify them, and we got the incumbent map, and we had people that literally went around and checked if there were actually central offices where they said there were, and TLDRs there were not, and that really and other than that, we really just polled individual residents to know who actually had what service. From Ting's perspective, we use data that all seems to emanate from 477 data at some point. There are individual communities do surveys, but it is a very much an imprecise practice at this point, as Patrick alluded to.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would add too, though, Paul, that there are a number of states recently, or in the last several years, that have engaged in sort of granular data collection efforts. So we can acknowledge that. And I think we also can acknowledge the fallacy of relying on 477 data. I know that's all, for a long time, the data that was out there, but NTIA, we launched a number of different data projects, and we've utilized NBAM, National Broadband Availability Map, and then also, states, again, as I said at the top of the comments, that states have been on the forefront of utilizing more granular data regarding where broadband is, mapping and visualization efforts, and we can continue to build on those, as well as some exciting new developments as well.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, and just to add, I mean, we see a lot of data sets, publicly available, ones that we've procured or received via projects, and it's one of those things that we spend a lot of time in every kickoff or establishment of project, looking through and assessing that data set to see, what's the best way to utilize it and how do we augment it with other data sets. I agree, wholeheartedly with what all the panelists are saying, that we look at all those, as many data sets as possible, get them from as many places as we can, and we try to fuse that data to make it useful for the purpose of that project. So it is a challenge, and it's one of those things. I don't think there'll ever be a silver bullet, because the data sets are so disparate. There's very little interoperability in terms of the schemas in which they live. And it is, again, it's something that we could no doubt spend a lot of time talking to, in terms of how do we make the most of what's out there. Thank you for that. Thanks, Scott. I know you got to run. Appreciate your time. In terms of, so yeah, we'll kick on. We've got a few more questions here. I've got Monica, for yourself, if let's say I'm a local community leader, right? And I've heard about this thing called broadband. Don't really know what it is. All I know is that my kids love to be on TikTok all day. What are the first things I should be looking at? Like, what do I do next? Like, how do I kick something off even though I know my community needs it? What would you recommend are the first steps?
Well, it's interesting because I've actually been through this myself, where, when I moved to Western Massachusetts and I thought I could telecommute and found out my only option was dial up. I did then immediately, the first thing I did in that community was go to the select board, and, they said, yes, you and many other people are dissatisfied with the level of connectivity here. And the first thing they did was form a committee within our town of 900 residents to, sort of look at what the landscape was, what was going on in terms of funding, what our options were. And, that then moved to 11 communities banding together, which then turned into 44 communities banding together that didn't have internet access, and forming the governance structure, which fortunately existed in Massachusetts to solve the problem. Now, that happened over a number of years, and now many of those towns do have fiber to the premise networks. It's a complex process, but I would say there are, as a community leader, if you want to build your own network and you're not looking to necessarily partner with a company like Ting, because we have a robust selection of partnership options with municipalities. But if they're looking to build their own network, there are some communities that have blazed the trail there that you can follow. If municipalities are interested in partnering and don't really know that much about it, I always encourage every single leader to be as informed as possible. So to do your own research probably makes sense, though, if you want to move forward with something formally, like engage a partner. Probably makes sense to engage a consultant under specific parameters. Know your goals, but definitely start with a committee within the community of people who probably have a wider base of knowledge and or interest in solving that issue.
Thanks, Monica. And I suppose going off from that, Patrick Thibault, I think you touched on this before, but sometimes these, as Monica said, these communities are put together through a need that's shared in that community, and they've started thinking about this. What are some of the things that you caution these communities on, or help them understand from your perspective? Because you oftentimes, meaning the broadband group, come in as consultants, right? So you would be sometimes that type of consultant that is engaged to take them to the next step.
The broadband group's been called the broadband group since the 90s. So educating people on what broadband is something we've been doing for decades. What we caution them with is understanding the metrics of the industry, right? Business models with 60% take rate, being the overbuilder. Not impossible, very hard. And they need to understand that, right? So we spend a lot of time just educating them, what take rates might look like, what services might look like, what different pockets of the community might adopt and accept. And, I just want to go back to one of the earlier conversations, right? Accessibility, access to fiber doesn't mean you're bridging the digital divide. You still need to solve the affordability problem. And if fiber everywhere was affordable, it would mostly be done already, right?
Thanks, Patrick. Patrick Reams, I saw you smiling as Pat was answering. Did you want to add anything from that perspective?
The take rate thing, it going to people who aren't in the business of selling something and going, do you want to convince 2 out of every 3 people you meet to buy something from you? And having to educate people that that's what a 60% take rate is. The note I wrote is when we talk to, again, our primary customers are rural cooperatives, but we have been working with more municipal and other entities. A successful project is driven by why. Reason and mission drive the success. So I think building one of these projects, it has to keep coming back to why are you doing it? Why are you doing it? Why are you doing it? And once you can answer that confidently, you can build all the support systems about how to do it.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, that's so important. We've had that on a few occasions. Those that really understand, have a very clear why, have a better chance of success. Duke, in coming to you, right? Just sort of going off that, how often do you see these projects where they really, you're coming in as a construction vendor, oftentimes you're very late to the party, right? We've talked about this. They've set the timeframes. Do you feel you hear a very resounding understanding or mission from these community leaders or the project leaders on why they're doing it?
I think the why is very well determined. The why is, I wouldn't say it's the easy part, but the ones that have gotten far enough along have gotten that figured out. But it might have taken them a while, so they've quite often figured that out. The bigger issue, once it gets to me, has just been some of the other things we've talked about. On have they really given themselves the right time? They looked at the metrics, to Patrick's point on the metrics. Do they understand their take rates? Some of those metrics are the same thing, like the schedule to build out, the schedule, the budget to build out. If you've got an issue in one of those places, you likely have an issue in all of them. Because if you go into it with a flawed take rate, then you probably have a flawed budget too. And the reason they're using a 60+% take rate is because they're getting some form of realism into the budget and realizing that, well, this one's going to be fairly expensive. So in order for this to work, we have to have 60% take rate. So you turn into this, well, it has to be that. Well, you can say that it has to be that. It has to be that for the model to work. But that's part of the fallacy that you got to deal with from the beginning. And Pat brought this up a minute ago, is if it was cheap, somebody already would have done it. If the business model had been there for the last 20 years for somebody to build fiber everywhere in the United States, it would have already been built. The fact of the matter is, now we're starting to look at the places where the model it's not a slam dunk. It's more of a, well, it might work if the take rates do creep up a little bit more, or if we can drive our construction costs down far enough, the model works, which is why a lot of municipalities and even co-ops, for that matter, that are very involved in the community are having these conversations, and the incumbent phone carrier isn't having this conversation because they already built out the things that made sense for them to build out. Now we're looking at getting things funded that don't necessarily make sense in the open market.
Thanks, Duke.
Sometimes the why, Duke, can just be because we don't like the incumbent. I'm seeing municipalities now coming in, bonding out with sales tax and going, we lost control of the incumbent when statewide franchise agreements came out. We want to own our own destiny. Yep. So, I mean, the why matters, but the why can just be because we want to, if there's the financial backing to do it.
Thanks, Pat. And look, we've got time for final remarks too. We're coming up to time. Patrick, I might start with you. I'll go in reverse order. Patrick Reen, because, just to follow on from that, what would be the last, remark you'd like to make to our audience?
The biggest thing in any fiber project is planning. The biggest thing in these are all the largest expenditures of capital, whatever organization you're with or working with are likely to expend at one time in your lifetime. Take the time to research what you're going to do and do it well. And any of the people on this webinar, I think, would be able to help you do that. Thanks,
Patrick. Duke, any final remarks?
Patrick kind of hit the nail on the head, but I'll add one thing to that is it's engage your partners as early as possible. And even if you're not ready to kind of get into the process of issuing RFPs, build relationships with people that are industry professionals that can help you and feed you information. A lot of the lessons learned that a lot of us on this call have had, everybody can use. So if you build relationships, and I can tell you that, folks like myself, we take calls all the time to discuss this with whether it be co-ops, municipalities. I'll gladly have those conversations because it's those lessons learned that can really get you on to the next steps.
Thanks, Duke. Patrick Tebow.
I'm going to pile on with the planning. If you've worked with me, I have a plan A and a plan B, always being worked out. Also, just being realistic, right? Back to, business models, take rates, what your market can bear is very important to understand.
Thanks, Patrick. Monica.
I'm actually, I'm going to say two things, but first I do want to tie it back to the title of this around digital divide. I think, as somebody who has struggled with this for a long time, now I have gigabit internet at home, so it's no longer an issue. I've never been more optimistic about seeing credible solutions to the digital divide and also the national expansion, the national build out of next generation fiber infrastructure throughout the country. And, I think everybody is coming to the table with much more realistic perspectives on what it takes to make that happen. It's not easy. And for communities that they're starting out, or perhaps they're, partway into the process, there's so much information out there. Municipal initiatives in particular are very happy to share their best practices and lessons learned, which is, I think is very valuable for communities to engage in. And lastly, if you think that, we would be a good partner, you have any questions specific to Ting and our partnership models, please reach out.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all. And Derek, I'll throw to you to close us out.
Perfect. Yeah, I want to thank all of our attendees for making time to join on a busy, I'm sure for everyone, Tuesday, and a very special thank you to all of our panelists. This has been a tremendous amount of information and best practice sharing. So thank you all for that. We will make the recording of this available and will be shared out to everyone that's registered to attend. So then, of course, you can share with your friends and peers and colleagues that are looking for some of this information as well. If you do have any additional questions for us at Biarri Networks, you can reach us at info@biarri.com and we'll get you pointed to the right direction, whether it be a question for us or, of course, any of the amazing panelists we've had here today. So thank you all very much for the time and looking forward to seeing you out there in the field.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.